Rather than a tale of greed, the history of luxury goods could, I think, more accurately be read as the record of emotional trauma. It's the legacy of people who felt pressured by the insensitivity of others to impress them through the use of material objects. And that really places the onus for what's going on in the world of luxury goods, not just on the buyers, but also on their audience. Because I think it's an uncomfortable but very true fact that the amount of love that you receive from the world is dependent upon the number of status symbols that you can wield.
Signs of how much we crave respect don't only lie in our appetite for shopping. They also lie in our extreme touchiness about whether or not we're being taken seriously. A touchiness that can lead people to challenge each other to fights and even fatal duels to prove themselves. From its origins in Renaissance Italy until its end in the First World War, the practice of dueling claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people the world over. Status was a matter of honor. The reasons for challenging someone to a duel were often petty in the extreme. In Paris in 1878, one man killed another who had described his apartment as tasteless. In Florence in 1902, a literary man ended the life of a cousin who'd accused him of not understanding Dante. And in France, under the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, 2 officers of the guard fought over the ownership of an Angora cat.
Dueling symbolizes a radical incapacity to believe that our status could be our business, something that we decided and then didn't change according to the shift in the views of our audience. For the jeweler, what other people make of him is the only factor in settling what he can think of himself. He can't continue to remain acceptable in his own eyes if those around him think him a fool or an effeminate, a liar or an idiot. He'd rather die by a bullet or a stab wound rather than let unfavorable ideas about him remain lodged in the public mind.
Even though dueling may have gone out of fashion, many disputes and lawsuits continue to be fights about status. 22-year-old Damien Cope became involved in a confrontation after telling a gang member to put away a gun because there were women and children about in a park in South London.
On Burgess Park that day, there was a notorious gang member, and for whatever reason, he felt that Damien disrespected him. He has a confrontation with Damien in Gangland. That's what a gang member has, a confrontation with you. He produces and lets Damien see he has a weapon. And Damien disrespected him by telling him to put the weapon away and fight him on a one-to-one, and the best man to walk away. And for that, Damien gave himself serious problems. The consequences are then there's a standoff. This person's going to get it. I clearly remember the last time I looked at the clock, it was 9:30, and I had fell asleep. And the next thing I knew was the phone was ringing, and it was Fiona, Damien's girlfriend, and she was screaming down the phone, "Damien's been shot." I jumped up and I said, "What?" She said, "Damien's been shot." Felt suddenly very weak and like something had been zapped from me. It was like I felt Damien leave. I felt him leave my body because I carried this child for 9 months. I grew him for 22 years. And as his mother, I felt him leave. We eventually got to the UCH. Joanne, the nurse, and 2 armed police officers were coming towards the entrance. And I knew by her face what she was going to say, and she just nodded her head and said, "I'm so sorry, he's gone." And I said, "Please take me to Damien, please, I'm begging you, take me to my son." She took my hand and she took me down a corridor, and I saw my child laying there, and I hugged him. I asked him why somebody had shot him. What did you do so bad for somebody to take your life?
Damien Cope's death is a shocking example of the consequences of a dispute about status. Very few of us pick up guns when we're insulted, but the feeling of vulnerability to others' view of us is sadly only too common. It's worth asking why this anxiety about status should nowadays be worse than it's ever been in history.
Living standards in the West have hugely improved in the last 200 years. There have been major increases in life expectancy, economic opportunity, and wealth generally. And yet, despite these improvements, it's possible to argue that we're today much more status conscious and status anxious than we ever were in the days of lords and ladies and horse-drawn carriages. And for a reason why, we should travel back to history, and there we'll see that for all their many disadvantages, old societies had one big advantage when it came to status.
Before the middle of the 18th century, status tended to be handed out in very particular ways. Firstly, it mattered not what you did, but who you were, who your parents were, what kind of background you had. Consequently, there was real cynicism about the character of those at the top of society. They weren't necessarily the best, they were those who'd been handed their privileges on a plate. Secondly, there was very little social mobility. You tended to stay where you were. And thirdly, a related point, people tended to have very low expectations of the kind of life that they could have. Under the old feudal system, only a very few had ever aspired to wealth and fulfillment. The majority knew well enough that they were condemned to exploitation and resignation. The working classes were considered creatures lacking in reason, and therefore naturally fitted to leading dismal lives, as beasts of burden were to tilling fields. The notion that inequality was fair, or at least irrevocable, was often shared by the oppressed themselves. With the spread of Christian teachings during the later Roman Empire, many fell prey to a religion that taught them to interpret their unequal treatment as part of a natural and unchangeable order. In his book Polycraticus of 1159, the English medieval philosopher John of Salisbury became the most famous Christian writer to compare society to a body and to use the analogy to justify a system of natural inequality. In Salisbury's account, every part of a state could be compared to a part of an individual human body. So the ruler was rather like a head, the parliament like the lungs, the treasury like the stomach, the army like the hands, and the working classes in general like the feet, with the peasantry in particular being compared to the toes. Behind this admittedly rather insulting metaphor lay the idea that everyone in society had been accorded an unalterable role. According to the old class system, to ask why some people were allowed to feast in banqueting halls while others were condemned to tilling the soil was an impossible question, almost as impossible as to ask whether God really existed. In the old status system, you either had status or didn't, and if you didn't, there wasn't much you could do about it. The old system was patently unfair. Then gradually, in the middle of the 18th century, a new way of distributing status emerged. A way that gave hope to millions of people and dramatically changed their lives, but at the same time, a way that brought a new level of anxiety to the lives of many. The new system was called meritocracy.